The light came first. That was always how it began, before the cold released its grip on the morning and before the town of Ironvale stirred itself into the slow, practical business of another autumn day. The light came first, a thin blade of it sliding through the gap between the curtain and the window frame, falling across the floorboards in the particular way that light falls, when it is not yet fully committed to the day, when it is still testing the room to see if anything has changed in the night. Nell Greystone was already awake when it arrived. She had been awake for some time, lying on her back in the narrow bed, in the room she kept as spare and functional as a working tool, listening to the sounds the building made as the temperature outside continued its slow descent toward what the season had been promising for weeks. The boards contracted. The single window in the north wall held a thin rime of frost at its lower edge that had not been there 3 mornings ago. She studied the frost without alarm, the way a doctor studies a symptom that confirms what the patient has not yet admitted. She already knew what it meant. She had known since the first week of September, when the elk had moved off the high meadows a full 2 weeks earlier than the previous year, and the Stellar's jays had gone quiet in a way that was not the quiet of contentment, but the quiet of departure. She rose before the frost could be explained to anyone. This was her way. She did not linger in the space between sleep and action. She had learned long ago, in the years before Ironvale, in the years that she did not discuss with anyone in this town, that the space between sleep and action was where the grief lived, and grief required invitation to expand. And she had made a practice of refusing to send one. She dressed in the order she always dressed: the wool undershirt first, then the flannel over it, then the heavy canvas trousers she had bought in Pueblo the year before for their weight and their resistance to the rock dust that had become a permanent feature of her working days. She laced her boots at the kitchen table with the particular attention she brought to small tasks, making each one complete before moving to the next. Cobb was waiting by the door. He was always waiting by the door in the mornings. The German shepherd was 10 years old and had been with her for 9 of those years, acquired as a pup from a ranch family passing through Laramie, who had more dogs than they had use for. He was large even for his breed, with a coat that had gone from the sharp black and tan of his youth to something richer and more complex in middle age, a deep brown at the shoulders that shifted toward rust at the flanks and eyes, the amber color of creek water in late summer. He did not jump or vocalize in the mornings. He simply stood by the door with a contained readiness that Nell had come to think of as the most honest kind of loyalty, the kind that does not perform itself but simply exists, available and steady day after day. She opened the door. The air off the mountains came in like a judgment. October in Ironvale, Colorado, in the year 1893, was not a gentle thing. The town sat at 8,000 feet in a valley that the Rocky Mountains enclosed on 3 sides, and the mountains did not moderate the weather so much as amplify it, gathering the systems that came down from the north and concentrating them in the valley the way a lens concentrates light. The mornings were already below freezing. By midwinter, the temperatures would fall to places that the human body understood only as threat. Nell pulled the door shut behind her and stood on the small porch for a moment, looking north. The sky above the northern ridgeline was the color she had been watching for. It was not the ordinary gray of an overcast autumn morning. It was something denser, a specific shade that she associated with a particular kind of atmospheric pressure, with moisture, that had traveled a very long distance and was now in the final stages of arriving. The clouds at the upper edge of the range had a particular architecture, a layered horizontal quality that she had seen before, in circumstances she did not wish to revisit. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, Then she picked up the pack she had staged the night before against the porch post, settled it onto her shoulders, and started up the mountain. The path to Copper Ridge was not a path that anyone in Ironvale had made. It existed because Nell had made it beginning in the autumn of 1889, her first season in the high country, walking the same ground often enough, and with enough intention that the ground eventually acknowledged her presence and arranged itself accordingly. It rose from the eastern edge of town at an angle that looked discouraging from below, and was in fact merely demanding a steady climb through stands of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir that gave way above the tree line to open scree, and then to the sheer face of red sandstone that formed the upper portion of the ridge. The mine entrance was set into this face at a point that was not visible from the valley floor, which was one of the reasons she had chosen it. She had been making this walk every morning for 4 years. The town had watched her make it for 4 years. This was not an exaggeration. Ironvale was a small community, perhaps 230 souls by the most recent count. A former silver mining settlement that had survived the exhaustion of its original purpose by transitioning slowly, and not always gracefully, into a combination of small-scale ranching and timber operations. The kind of town where the movement of any individual was noted from windows and doorways, and the fronts of establishments not from malice exactly, but from the particular attention that small communities develop when the available stimuli are limited and the winters are long. Nell Greystone, a widow of 63, who had arrived one September afternoon in 1889 with a shepherd dog, a loaded wagon, and no prior relationship to anyone in the valley, was not a person whose daily activities went unremarked. She had given them very little to work with. She had bought the rights to Copper Ridge from the estate of the last operating company, which had pulled out in 1881 after the silver played out, leaving behind the physical infrastructure of the mine and a legal title that had been sitting unclaimed in the county records long enough that the price she paid for it was a matter some residents of Ironvale still discussed with a mixture of bewilderment and retrospective resentment, as if they had been personally cheated out of a bargain they had never actually considered pursuing. She had hired no one. She had explained nothing. She paid for her purchases in coin, took exactly what she needed from Vera Stokes's general store, and kept the kind of social calendar that consisted entirely of the walk up the mountain and the walk back down. What she was doing up there was the question that had filled the gaps in conversation at the smithy, at the store, at the small church that served the valley on alternating Sundays when the circuit preacher could make it through the passes. The theories had evolved over 4 years, from the mildly curious to the firmly dismissive. She was looking for silver the company had missed. She was hiding from something or someone. She had lost her mind somewhere on the long road from wherever she had come from, and the mine was simply where the loss had deposited her. This last theory had the greatest traction and the most dedicated proponents principal among them. Gideon Kraft, the blacksmith, who had the particular gift of the confident man for transforming his ignorance into opinion and offering the result as community wisdom. Gideon was 55 and had lived in Ironvale for 20 of those years, long enough to consider himself a foundational element of the place, rather than simply a resident. He was large through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who have spent decades at physical work with hands like coal shovels and a voice calibrated to carry across the noise of a working forge. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything in his own assessment, and who had therefore never developed the particular humility that sustained wrongness tends to produce. He watched Nell Greystone walk past his smithy each morning with the evaluative expression of someone watching a weather system that is inconvenient but not threatening. and he said what he said about her with the easy authority of a man who believes his audience agrees with him, which they largely did because it was simpler than disagreeing. Baja Moher called her the Mine Witch. The words were not intended to travel up the mountain to where she worked and could not hear them. They were intended for the men gathered at the forge in the early mornings before the day's work began, who laughed the way men laugh at things that require no explanation and no defense because the target is absent and the speaker is confident. Vera Stokes was different in character but similar in effect. She ran the general store from behind a counter that she treated as both a place of business and a position of social authority, from which she observed and commented on the transactions and habits of everyone who entered. She was 50 years old, precise in her accounting and imprecise in her charity. A woman who had worked hard for what she had and had translated that hardship into a judgment of those she perceived as less practical or less deserving than herself. When Nell came in for her weekly supplies, Vera watched with the pointed attention of someone cataloging evidence for a conclusion already reached. The Dow Dan interaction happened on a Wednesday in early October. Nell set her items on the counter, and Vera looked at the 2 additional bottles of lamp oil among them and said that seemed like a considerable amount of oil for one person living in a mine. She said it in the way that comments are sometimes made in general stores addressed technically to the air or to an invisible audience, which made them simultaneously public and impossible to directly refute without appearing defensive. Nell picked up her items and said nothing. She counted out the coins, placed them on the counter with precision, and walked out with Cobb at her heel. This was her practice. Silence was not for Nell Greystone a failure of response. It was a considered strategy developed over many years in circumstances that had taught her that explanation was invitation. An invitation created expectation. An expectation created obligation. An obligation was the first step toward the particular kind of dependency she had spent 30 years ensuring she would never again experience. She said what needed to be said, and nothing else. And what she said was very little, and the town interpreted this as confirmation of whatever theory they were currently operating under. There was one exception. Dr. Elias Pruitt had been practicing medicine in Ironvale for 12 years, arriving a decade after the silver played out, drawn by the shortage of medical care in the high country, rather than by any particular attachment to the location. He was 60 years old, slight in build with the careful movements of a man who has learned to conserve energy over long days and longer nights. He had the doctor's habit of observation, without declaration of noting things, without immediately processing them into opinion. He had watched Nell for 4 years with the attention he brought to patients whose symptoms he had not yet organized into a diagnosis. He did not know what she was doing at Copper Ridge, but he noted with professional interest the specific nature of what she purchased. Not tools for mining, not equipment for assaying or sluicing or any of the other operations associated with mineral extraction. Sacks of a weight and density consistent with soil or grain, long bolts of canvas sheeting, coils of lightweight rope, small packets of the kind that contained seed. He noted over the seasons the way her purchases shifted, the way the volume of lamp oil increased in autumn and decreased in spring, the way she sometimes came in carrying samples of soil on her clothing that was darker and more mineral-rich than the red dust of the ridge surface, the kind of soil that came from below ground level rather than above it. He noted these things and filed them without conclusion, the way a careful doctor files observations that have not yet resolved into clarity. And sometime in September of 1893, when the pattern of her purchases indicated a sharp increase in preserved foodstuffs and an unusual quantity of salt and dried grain. He had quietly increased his own medical supplies by twice the amount he would ordinarily have held in reserve for a winter season. He did not explain this decision to anyone. He simply made it because his observations, whatever their ultimate meaning, pointed toward a conclusion that a careful person should prepare for. The morning of October the 4th, Nell reached the top of the first long switchback and stopped to shift the weight of her pack. From this height, the town was visible below in its entirety, a collection of structures along the single main street, smoke beginning to rise from the morning fires. She could see Gideon Craft's smithy at the north end, the bellows already working the first light of the forge, visible through the open front. She could see Vera Stokes's store in the middle of the block, the shutters not yet open. She could see the small white board structure that served as a combined church and meeting hall at the southern end. She looked at the town for a long moment. Then she looked north. The sky had changed in the hour since she had left her porch. The cloud system she had observed building above the northern ridge had moved south during her ascent and was now directly overhead. And it had revealed in its underside a texture she recognized, the specific granular quality of clouds that are carrying moisture at a temperature that will not release it as rain. The air pressure against her ears had dropped in the way she associated with significant incoming systems. The elk she had disturbed crossing the lower meadow 30 minutes ago had been moving south and east away from the high country, at the particular steady pace of animals responding to instinct rather than immediate threat. She turned and continued up the mountain. Below her, the town was beginning its day in the confidence of the prediction old Virgil had issued at the previous Sunday's gathering at the meeting hall. Virgil Dawes was 75 years old and had spent 50 of those years in the mountains of Colorado, and he wore this tenure as a credential of meteorological authority that no one in Iron Vale had seriously challenged in at least a decade. He had a system of signs and observations that he applied to seasonal forecasting with the conviction of a man whose past errors have been forgotten and whose occasional successes have been magnified in the retelling. He had looked at the sky and the animals and the behavior of the snowpack on the upper peaks in early September, and had declared in the authoritative drawl that carried across the meeting hall's interior that the coming winter would be a mild one. A few dustings, nothing that a properly stocked household could not manage with reasonable comfort. The town had received this prediction, the way it received most of Virgil's pronouncements, with the relief of people who wanted to believe the thing being told to them, which is a different and more powerful kind of reception than the belief that comes from evidence. They had stocked their larders and filled their woodpiles, and Gideon Craft had surveyed his smokehouse at the rear of his property and calculated that the hanging hams and the sealed barrels of salted pork represented a supply sufficient to carry his household through spring, with beef left over for trading. And he had felt the particular satisfaction of a self-reliant man in a situation that rewards self-reliance. It was into this settled comfort that Nell Greystone had introduced herself. It had not been planned. She was not, generally speaking, a person who introduced herself into public conversations, but she had come down from the mine on the afternoon of October the 6th for a supply run, and the gathering on the steps of the meeting hall where Virgil held informal court in good weather had been directly in her path, and she had stopped because the north wind had freshened in the past hour, in a way that meant something she could not leave unaddressed, and she had looked at the assembled faces and said what she said. She said Moordungnay would be the worst in 30 years. She said it in the flat, declarative tone she used for statements of observable fact, the same tone she would have used to say that the spring needed cleaning or that the road needed grading. She was not asking for agreement. She was not requesting that anyone take action. She was simply placing information in the air where it could be heard by people who might, if they were fortunate, decide to do something useful with it. Virgil looked at her with the expression of a man whose expertise has been questioned by someone who has not paid the dues that expertise requires. He said that the signs he read did not support that interpretation. He said this with the measured authority of someone who has read the signs for 50 years and knows the value of consistency. Gideon Kraft was on the steps, and he laughed the way he laughed when something confirmed his existing view of the world. He said that the mine witch was forecasting disasters now in addition to hauling dirt up a mountain. He said it with the easy confidence of a man who is performing for an audience that he knows is on his side, and several of the other men on the steps produced the sounds that confirmed his expectation. Nell looked at Gideon. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took for the laugh to finish. And in her face was nothing that could be described as anger, which was in some ways more unsettling than anger. What was in her face was simply the knowledge of what she knew, and the awareness of what it was going to cost these people to find out that she was right. 30 years, she said again. And she picked up her pack and continued toward the store. Behind her, the men on the steps continued their conversation. She heard Virgil reassert his forecast with somewhat more emphasis than he had used previously. She heard Gideon say something about women who lived alone too long and the effect it had on the capacity for rational thought. She heard the sounds of agreement. She noted the sounds of agreement and continued walking because the thing she needed to do in the next 2 weeks required full attention, and there was no portion of her available time that could be usefully directed toward people who were not yet ready to hear what she had to say. At Copper Ridge, in the hours after the supply run, she descended through the entrance passage with her lantern and checked everything that required checking. The passage was the part of the approach that newcomers found most disorienting, the narrow section of the original mine shaft that had collapsed and been carefully re-cleared over the first months after she acquired the property, reinforced with timber bracing. She had installed herself using techniques she had spent 2 winters learning from books acquired in Denver, and one very useful correspondence with a retired mining engineer in Leadville who had answered her written questions without ever asking why a woman in her late 50s wanted to know the load-bearing mathematics of underground timber framing. The passage was perhaps 40 feet of descending stone corridor, low enough that she moved through it with her shoulders slightly forward before it opened into the first of the chambers she had excavated and developed over 4 years of solitary work. The air changed at the point of opening. This was the thing that could not be prepared for by description, the quality of the air inside the developed section of the mine. Outside in October, at 8,000 feet, the air was cold and thin, and carried with it the particular sterility of altitude, the sense that nothing lived in it that did not have to. Inside the first chamber, the air was warm and humid and dense with the layered organic smell of growing things, of soil recently turned and vegetation transpiring, and the particular live sweetness of plants doing the work they were designed to do in conditions that suited them. It was the smell of the inside of a greenhouse and the inside of an old forest after rain, and something that had no exact parallel, the smell of life conducted underground, which had a quality of improbability that the senses registered before the mind could explain it. Nell moved through the first chamber with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows the space so completely that the lantern is more a courtesy than a necessity. The raised beds ran in 4 rows along the length of the chamber, each one 6 feet wide and 12 feet long, built up from the bedrock floor, with the dark, composted soil she had hauled in over the first year, and subsequently maintained through a cycling process. that used the waste from the animal pens at the back of the complex to feed the beds and the produce from the beds to feed the animals. The water came from a seam in the lower rock that she had found in her second month of exploration, a subsurface flow that moved through the formation at a constant temperature of 48 degrees, and at a volume that she had measured and remeasured across seasons to confirm its consistency. She had diverted a portion of it through a channel of fitted stone that distributed moisture to the beds through a system of small controlled openings, a system that had taken her most of the second year to calibrate correctly, and that she now operated with the same automatic competence with which a farmer manages an irrigation ditch. The kale was ready for its final harvest before the hard freeze she was anticipating. She moved along the beds and examined the plants, with her hands feeling the leaves for the texture that indicated peak maturity, the specific firmness that preceded the toughening that cold would induce in the outer leaves. The turnips in the adjacent bed had been ready for a week, and she had been pulling them in stages, storing them in the root cellar. She had cut into a side gallery at the rear of the complex, where the temperature held steady at just above freezing regardless of the conditions outside. She estimated 40 pounds of turnips in storage, 60 of potatoes in the main bins, a substantial quantity of dried kale and preserved beets in the sealed jars on the shelving she had built against the east wall of the second chamber. The animals were in the far gallery. She had acquired the sheep gradually, beginning with 2 ewes in her second autumn, adding to the small flock as the pasture and feed situation inside the mine allowed. There were now 7, including a ram she had purchased from a rancher 2 valleys over, who had given her a price that suggested he believed she was not entirely serious in her intentions. The chickens she had started with a dozen and maintained at approximately that number through the natural cycling of the flock. The animals provided milk and eggs, and when the time came, meat and their waste provided the nitrogen that kept the soil beds productive, and the heat of their bodies in the confined space of the far gallery contributed meaningfully to the temperature of the whole complex, which operated at something between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Throughout the year, regardless of what the mountain was doing outside, Cobb walked the perimeter of the chambers in the methodical way he walked it every morning, nose close to the ground, checking the scent record of the previous night. He had never found anything to concern him in this ritual, but he performed it with the undiminished seriousness that characterized everything he did, because he was a dog who understood that the value of a check was not diminished by the consistency of its results. Nell harvested the kale and carried it to the processing area near the water channel, where she cleaned and prepared vegetables for preservation. She worked steadily, not quickly, with the economical movements of someone who has done this particular task enough times that the body knows its part and the mind is free for other things. And what the mind was occupied with as her hands worked through the harvest was the sound of Gideon Kraft's laugh on the steps of the meeting hall, and the way the men around him had produced their sounds of agreement, and the way Virgil Dawes had reasserted his forecast with the particular emphasis of a man who needs the reassurance of his own voice. She was not angry. She wanted to be precise about this, at least in her own accounting. What she felt was not anger, which requires a belief that the situation ought to be different from what it is. What she felt was something closer to a weight, the specific gravity of knowing what is coming and being unable to transfer that knowledge to people who have not yet earned the willingness to receive it. She had felt this weight before. She had felt it in other forms, in other places, and she knew what it meant and what it did not mean. And she knew that the only response to it that served any useful purpose was to continue the work in front of her. She continued the work in front of her. By midday, she had completed the kale harvest and stored the last of it, had checked the water channel for the small obstructions that occasionally developed where sediment accumulated, at the fitted stone joints had refilled the oil reservoirs in the lamps that she kept burning at low intensity throughout the complex. During the daylight hours, because the plants required a period of light each day that the underground location could not naturally provide, and had eaten the meal she had brought up in her pack, sitting on the stool near the water channel while Cobb ate beside her. The meal was simple. Everything in this place was simple, which was not the simplicity of deprivation, but the simplicity of a life organized around what was necessary and functional, a life from which everything had been removed that could not carry its own weight. She had arrived at this simplicity not by philosophy, but by experience, by decades of learning through the specific and unambiguous instruction of loss. What was essential and what was surplus. And she had found that the result, while not comfortable in the way that excess is comfortable, had a durability that excess did not. After the meal, she went back to work. In the late afternoon, when the light coming through the ventilation shaft at the upper end of the complex had shifted from the thin blue of midday high altitude to the amber quality of late sun, she prepared to descend to the valley. She banked the stove in the animal gallery to hold through the night, checked the water channel one final time, and stood at the entrance to the passage that led up to the surface with her lantern in one hand and the emptied pack in the other. Cobb sat beside her, looking up at her face with the attentive patience of an animal that reads its person's hesitation and waits without demanding resolution. She was not hesitating for any reason she could clearly name. She was simply standing in the entrance of the place she had built over 4 years of solitary labor and listening to it, to the specific sounds it made. The water and the animals and the faint movement of air through the ventilation system and the deep old silence of the rock around all of it. The silence that had been there before she arrived and would be there after she was gone. She was listening to it the way you listen to something you have made to see if it will hold. It would hold. She came down the mountain in the late afternoon with the lowering sun behind the western ridge, throwing long shadows across the valley floor, and the north wind moving in the spruce stands with a sound she knew as well as her own breathing. She walked through the edge of town, on the path that took her past the smithy, and she heard Gideon Craft's forge and Gideon Craft's voice, and the sound of men talking in the easy way of men who believe the season ahead will be manageable. She did not stop. She walked past Cobb at her heel and reached her house at the eastern edge of town. As the first stars appeared above the ridgeline in the east, she lit the lamp in the kitchen. She prepared what she needed for the following morning. She moved through the small house with the measured efficiency of a woman who has organized her life around the elimination of waste, who knows where every object is and uses every object she keeps, who has reduced the physical texture of her daily existence to exactly what is necessary, and has found in that reduction something that resembles peace without quite being it. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after the work was done. Cobb settled at her feet. The wind had picked up outside, and she could hear it working against the north wall of the house with an increasing purpose that the walls were adequate to, but that spoke in the language of pressure and temperature, and the long experience of a woman who had spent 30 years learning to listen to weather, of what was coming. In the morning, the north wind was stronger. In 3 days, it was something else entirely. The first storm arrived on a Sunday. It did not arrive the way storms arrived in the ordinary course of a Colorado autumn, with the gradual thickening of clouds and the progressive cooling of air that gave experienced mountain people time to bring in the last of the wood and secure the loose things and settle into the particular indoor patience that winter required. It arrived the way a door is opened on a cold room all at once, a complete transition from one state to another, as if the atmosphere had simply decided that the season of waiting was finished. By the time the people of Ironvale woke on Sunday morning and looked out their windows, the valley was already unrecognizable. The snow had begun sometime in the night, in that unreachable portion of the dark hours when the town was fully asleep, and had no witnesses, and it had come down with a density and a purpose that bore no relationship to the mild dusting old Virgil had predicted. It came down in the specific way of high-volume mountain snowfall, not in the distinct flakes of a moderate storm, but in a continuous, obliterating curtain of white that reduced visibility to the length of an outstretched arm and covered the ground at a rate that made the word accumulation inadequate. By 8 in the morning, when Gideon Kraft opened his front door to assess the situation, the snow on his porch was past his knees. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. He was not a man who was easily impressed by weather. He had lived in the Colorado mountains for 2 decades, and he had seen significant winters, and he had come through all of them with the household more or less intact, and his opinion of his own preparedness more or less confirmed. He stood in the doorway and looked at the snow past his knees and at the white wall of falling snow beyond it that had entirely erased the visible world, and he felt the first faint intimation of something he would not have named as concern at that moment, but that occupied a position in his chest that concern typically occupied. He closed the door and went to check the smokehouse. The smokehouse was a substantial structure at the rear of his property, built from timber he had felled himself in his second year in Ironvale, sealed against moisture and cold with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his family's winter security resided within it. It held, as of the previous week's inventory, a quantity of smoked and salted meat that he had calculated would carry his household from late October to the end of March with a comfortable margin. He had done this calculation with the particular precision of a man who takes satisfaction in demonstrating his own foresight, who measures his worth in practical terms, and finds the measurement favorable. He opened the smokehouse and stood in the doorway looking at what was there, and he felt the calculation he had made revise itself slightly in an uncomfortable direction. The quantity was what he had inventoried. What had changed was his sense of how long it would need to last. The storm outside was not a storm that resolved itself in a week. He had seen enough weather to know the difference between systems that passed and systems that settled. And what was happening over Ironvale on this Sunday morning had the quality of a system that had come to stay for a while. He closed the smokehouse and went back inside. The first storm lasted 3 days. When it paused on the 4th morning, the people of Ironvale emerged from their homes into a world that had been remeasured in every dimension. The snow in the open ground between structures stood at 6 feet. The drifts against the north-facing walls of buildings reached the eaves. The road out of the valley, which ran south through a gap in the lower ridge and was the single connection between Ironvale and the county road that led eventually to civilization of a larger kind, was invisible, not buried and passable with effort. Invisible, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain as if it had never existed at all. The people stood in the street they had excavated to allow movement between buildings, and they looked at what the mountains had done to their valley, and they talked about it in the way that people talk about things they do not yet want to fully confront, using the language of inconvenience rather than emergency, saying that it would melt off in a week, or that the pass always cleared by November, or that they had seen worse in such and such a year and come through fine. The names of years they had survived were invoked like incantations. The inventory of past hardships was recited as evidence of current adequacy. Old Virgil was notably quieter than usual, his meteorological authority having suffered a credibility event that even his most loyal constituents were having difficulty explaining away. On the morning of the fifth day, the second storm arrived. It was larger than the first. For the next 3 weeks, the valley of Ironvale existed in a state of progressive isolation that moved through the stages of inconvenience and difficulty and genuine hardship with a momentum that community optimism could slow, but not stop. The storms came in sequence, each one building on the consolidation of the previous, packing the snow against itself until it achieved the density of something almost structural. A new terrain imposed over the old one that was no longer soft and traversable, but hard and impassable. The temperature between storms dropped to levels that froze the water in the pipes of the more poorly built structures and drove the cattle into their barns and kept them there, and drove the deer and the elk down off the mountains and out of the valley entirely south toward elevations where survival was possible. Hunting became impossible within the first 2 weeks. The game was gone, relocated by instincts older than the town, and the men who had relied on supplementing their stores through the season found the mountain empty of everything except snow and cold and the wind that moved across the surface of the packed drifts with a sound like something being patiently worn away. The firewood went faster than anyone had budgeted for. Cold at this sustained intensity was not the cold of an average winter, not the cold that the calculations of experienced mountain people accounted for. It was a cold that found every weakness in every structure and pressed through them with a persistence that required the fires to burn hotter and longer than the woodpiles had anticipated. The arithmetic was simple and unpleasant. The wood that was supposed to last through March was going to run out in January if the temperatures held. Gideon Kraft opened his smokehouse for the last time on the morning of the 22nd day of continuous winter. He had not told his wife before this visit how much remained. He had been managing the inventory with a private optimism that required him not to look too directly at the actual numbers, and he had been feeding his household from it with a deliberate restraint that had produced complaints at the table he had answered with reassurances he was no longer fully certain of. He opened the smokehouse on the morning of the 22nd day and looked at what was inside, and the private optimism dissolved in the cold air of the small building as completely and finally as if it had never existed. He stood there for a period of time he could not have measured. The wind moved over the roof. The cold inside the smokehouse was the same cold as outside, which meant the smokehouse was no longer doing the work of preservation that had been its only value, which meant the calculation had been wrong in more ways than the one he had been trying not to see. He had calculated wrong about the quantity, and he had calculated wrong about the cold, and he had calculated wrong about the duration, and he had built his family's security on a foundation of assumptions that had turned out to be the assumptions of a man who had not faced a winter like this one, and had not known he had not faced it. He closed the door. He stood outside the smokehouse in the snow, with the door closed behind him, and the wind moving over the roof and the sound of his children inside the house audible through the wall. And he stood there, with the knowledge of what he had done and what he had failed to do, settling onto him with a weight that was different in kind from anything he had carried before. It was not the weight of difficulty which he knew how to carry. It was the weight of having been wrong in a way that had consequences for people who had relied on him to be right, and having known in some portion of himself he had chosen not to consult, that there was a reason to question his certainty, and having chosen not to consult it, he thought about the woman on the steps of the meeting hall 2 weeks before the first storm. He thought about the flat, uninflected way she had said what she had said, and the way he had laughed and the sounds the other men had made, and the way she had looked at him for exactly the length of time it took the laugh to finish, and then turned and walked away. He thought about that look with a specificity that surprised him. because he had told himself at the time that it meant nothing, that it was the unfocused expression of a woman who had been alone too long on a mountain, and he had filed it under the general category of things that confirmed what he already believed about her. But the look remembered now in the cold outside the empty smokehouse did not look like nothing. It looked like the face of someone who knows what is coming, and knows that the knowledge cannot be transferred, and is deciding what to do with that. Inside the house, one of his children called for something. He heard his wife answer. He pushed off from the smokehouse wall and walked back through the snow toward the house, because there was nothing else to do at that moment except continue. And because the question of what came next was forming in the back of his mind with a clarity that he was not yet ready to name out loud. By the end of the 4th week, the town had reorganized itself around its actual circumstances, rather than its preferred narrative of them. Doc Pruitt had been making his rounds on the tunnels the community had excavated between buildings, checking on the households, distributing the extra medical stores he had laid in with a quiet foresight that the town noted with a gratitude tinged with the particular discomfort of people who are being helped by someone they had not thought to ask. He had established a system of daily wellness checks for the elderly and the very young, which were the populations most vulnerable to the compound threat of cold and inadequate nutrition. And he had been moving through this system with the steady competence of a man who had prepared for something like this without knowing its specific shape. Vera Stokes had locked the doors of her general store on the day she determined that the shelves contained nothing she could sell, at a rate that would make any difference to any household in the valley. She had done this privately without announcement, slipping the bolt on the front door, and going to the back room and sitting at her counting table with the ledger open in front of her, and the numbers in it telling her a story she did not want to read. She sat there for a long time. The store, which had been the source of her identity and her authority in this community for 15 years, was now an empty room with locked doors, and she was sitting in the back of it with no customers and nothing to offer anyone, and a cold that was working its way through the store's inadequate insulation with the patient indifference of weather toward commerce. She thought about Nell Greystone. She did not want to think about Nell Greystone. She had spent 4 years developing a set of firmly held opinions about Nell Greystone that had served as both commentary and entertainment across those years. And thinking about her now in the context of the situation the town was in required a revision of those opinions that Vera was finding genuinely difficult to execute. But she thought about her because the thought was there and could not be entirely evicted by the effort of will, and because the specific memory of Nell's weekly supply purchases, which Vera had observed and cataloged and commented on and been irritated by across 4 full years, were arranging themselves in a new configuration that she did not like the implications of. The dark jars of preserved food, the sacks of the weight that meant grain and root vegetables, the quantities of lamp oil that had seemed excessive for one person, the steady, systematic accumulation season by season of things that kept. Vera sat at her counting table and thought about these things, and the cold worked through the walls, and the storm continued outside, and after a while she got up and went to look at what she had in her own household stores, which was not a review she had been putting off, but that she conducted now with a level of attention she had not previously brought to it. The number she arrived at, expressed in days, was not comfortable. On the morning of the 28th day of winter, Gideon Kraft said it out loud. He said it in the general store, which had become the community gathering space. In the absence of any other heated public building, a dozen or so people wedged into the space between the empty shelves with the body heat of collective proximity doing the work the failing stove could not fully manage. Doc Pruitt was there. Vera Stokes was there behind her counter with the ledger closed because there was nothing to enter in it. Several of the men who had been at the forge and on the meeting hall steps in October were there, diminished by weeks of cold and short rations, and the particular erosion that prolonged difficulty performs on the kind of confidence that was never tested before. Gideon stood in the middle of the room and said what everyone in the room had been thinking in varying degrees of specificity and varying degrees of willingness to confront. He said they had to try for the mine. The room received this in the way that rooms receive statements that confirm what is already understood, but that someone has to say before anything can be done about it. There were questions about the snow depth on the slope and the wind exposure on the upper section of the path, and the temperature and whether 5 or 4 or 6 men made more sense than any other number given the conditions. Doc Pruitt said that the food and warmth situation in the valley was going to produce casualties within 2 weeks, if nothing changed, and he said it with the calm specificity of a doctor delivering a clinical assessment, which was more alarming than any amount of alarm would have been. He said there was no other option he could identify. He said this in a way that made clear he had been looking for other options and had not found any. Gideon put together a group of 5. He chose for capability rather than seniority for the men who still had their physical reserves most intact after 4 weeks of short rations and sustained cold. He chose 2 younger men who were strong and had shown steadiness, and 2 others who knew the upper mountain better than most from their summer work on the timber operations. And he chose himself, because whatever calculation he had made about his own culpability in the situation, the response to that calculation that made any sense was not to stand back from the hardest available task, but to put himself at the front of it. They prepared through the afternoon of the 28th day. They wrapped their boots in layers of wool and oilcloth, and wore every piece of clothing they possessed, in an order determined by insulating value rather than comfort. They carried empty canvas sacks and lengths of rope and the prayer that Ironvale's remaining pastor offered over them in the cold church that afternoon with a fervor that was not performance but genuine supplication. They left before dawn on the 29th day. Gideon had been on the lower section of the path to Copper Ridge in summer and knew its general direction. But the winter mountain presented itself as a different entity than the summer one, a landscape in which the landmarks of the warm season had been redistributed by snow into configurations that bore only a general relationship to what he remembered. The path was not visible. Nothing was visible that had depth less than 6 feet, which meant the surface they were moving across was 6 feet above the ground he knew, and the ground he knew was the only reference map available to him. He moved by direction and by the slope of the terrain beneath the snow, and by the occasional protrusion of a rock formation he recognized from above, and the 5 men moved in a line with Gideon at the front, because the front required the most physical effort in the unpacked snow, and because he had decided that the effort was his to bear. The cold was a different order of cold than the cold in the valley. At altitude, the wind had nothing to deflect it, and it moved across the snowfield with an efficiency that stripped warmth from any exposed surface in minutes. The men kept their faces covered to the degree possible and moved with their heads down at angles that minimized the wind's access to the gaps between layers. And still the cold found them working into the places where the coverings were less than perfect, into the seams and the edges, into the exposed portions of face above the scarves with a patient impersonal thoroughness. At the second long traverse where the path in summer crossed a wide open shoulder, before rising into the final approach to the ridge, the wind was fully exposed and fully committed, and the men crossed it in a line holding the rope Gideon had brought for exactly this section, because he had enough imagination to anticipate what crossing an open shoulder at 8,000 feet in a storm of this magnitude would require. 2 men went down in the crossing. The first went down at the midpoint of the traverse, his legs simply stopping in the snow without warning, the body making a unilateral decision that the forward progress being demanded of it was not something it could continue to provide. Gideon, at the end of the rope's length ahead, felt the tension change and turned and moved back through his own trail and got his shoulder under the man and talked to him in a way that was not conversation, but instruction. Simple and specific and without space in it for the consideration of alternatives. The man got up. He got up because the alternative to getting up was a specific and proximate consequence rather than an abstract one, and because Gideon's voice at that moment contained something that was not warmth exactly, but was not the absence of warmth either, something that connected to whatever was still operating in the man's body, and told it there was a reason to continue. The second went down near the far edge of the traverse and was retrieved in the same way. They reached the upper section of the approach in a state of depletion that Gideon would not have predicted was possible in himself, because he had not previously asked himself to do anything exactly like this in conditions exactly like these. And the distance between the version of himself he had held in his mind across 5 decades of physical work and the version of himself currently moving through wind-driven snow at the edge of his reserves was a distance he was experiencing with a clarity that had no room for the refinements of opinion. He thought about October. He thought about the steps of the meeting hall and the sound his laugh had made in the cold air. He did not think about these things to punish himself, because punishment at this altitude and in this wind was a luxury the situation did not support. He thought about them because they were present in him in a way that other things were not, in a way that seemed connected to the physical effort of each step, as if each step was a response to something he owed rather than something he chose. The entrance to Copper Ridge Mine appeared in the face of the sandstone formation at the upper end of the approach as a darkness against the white, a specific shape shadow that was not the shadow of a rock formation, but the shadow of an opening of a thing, made rather than a thing found. The snow had accumulated around the timber, bracing at the entrance in a way that left a clear depression, a sheltered space where the wind was less and where the surface temperature was, if not warm, at least different from the exposed face of the ridge. Gideon stopped. The 5 men collected behind him in the space before the entrance, and the wind dropped in the shelter of the rock face to something that could be stood in rather than endured. And they stood there for a moment in the relative quiet and breathed. The entrance was closed. A heavy timber door fitted into the frame of the original mine shaft opening, seated well against the cold. He raised his fist and knocked on the door, and the knock sounded in the silence of the sheltered space, with a plainness that he found oddly difficult, the physical simplicity of the gesture against the weight of what it meant. He said her name. He said it the way a man says a name when the saying of it requires him to set down something he has been carrying, when the saying of it is an acknowledgement that the carrying was mistaken. He said it once, and then he said it again. And then he stood in the cold and waited, and the men behind him waited, and the wind moved over the ridge above them with a sound like something continuously beginning. Inside the door, Nell Greystone stood in the passage. She had heard the knock. She had heard it with the specific attention of someone who has spent 4 years in a place where the only sounds are the sounds she has made herself, or the sounds the mountain makes for whom. A knock on a door is a sound that has not previously occurred, a sound that sits outside the known vocabulary of this place and therefore requires a different kind of listening than the listening she applied to the familiar. Cobb was beside her. He was not at the door. He was beside her, which was a different position, a position that meant he was reading her rather than reading the sound, waiting for her response to determine his own. His amber eyes in the lantern light were on her face. She stood in the passage, and she listened to the voice on the other side of the door. And she knew the voice, and she knew the name the voice was saying, which was her name. And she stood with her hand not on the door but at her side, and she did not move. The voice said her name again and then said other things, words about the town, and about the cold, and about the state of the food supply, and about the children. And she heard all of these things with the full, undiminished attention she brought to information that mattered. And she stood and did not move. 30 years was the distance between this moment and the night she had sat in the snow with her back against a pine tree and listened to a wind like this one, and understood with the specific and permanent understanding that comes from a thing that cannot be revised, that she was alone and that she was going to remain alone in a way that the presence of other people could not alter, because the other people had looked at her through a door and seen someone whose claim on their resources was insufficient, and had made a calculation and closed the door. She had been the one at the door then. She had heard the voices inside, and she had understood what the voices were saying and what the voices were not saying, and the understanding had not left her. In 30 years had traveled with her through the decades and the miles to this passage in the rock where she now stood with her hand at her side, and the voice of Gideon Kraft on the other side of the timber door. She was not going to open it. This was not a decision she made. It was a condition she found herself in, the way you find yourself in weather as a fact of your present location, rather than a choice about it. She was standing in the passage, and the door was closed, and Cobb was looking at her face, and the voice outside was saying things. And she was not going to open the door, because the door being closed was 30 years of understanding made physical. And she did not know how to open it without opening all of that as well. And she was not certain she had the capacity for what was on the other side of all of that. Cobb leaned against her leg. He did not do anything more than that. He did not make a sound, or move toward the door, or in any other way indicate a preference for action. He simply leaned against her leg with the steady, warm pressure of his substantial body, and looked up at her face, and held that position the way he held all positions, with a patience that did not ask anything of her, except that she remained present in the moment they were in rather than in the moments she was remembering. The voice outside changed. Not Gideon's voice, a different voice, smaller in register, higher in pitch. A voice that was not doing what adult voices do in extremity, which is to manage itself toward comprehensibility, but was simply producing sound that was the direct result of cold and fear, and the kind of exhaustion that a child's body reaches faster than an adult's, because it has fewer reserves to draw on before it reaches the place where the body simply says what it needs without intermediary. The sound was thin in the wind. It was a child's voice, not old enough to have the full development of register that makes a voice carry. And it was saying something indistinct, not to her. Not to anyone specifically, just saying something the way children say things when they are past the point of strategic communication and are simply occupying the air with the fact of their presence and their need. Nell stood in the passage and heard that sound, and something in her chest rearranged itself. Not opened exactly, rearranged, like a door that has been stuck, not because it is locked, but because the frame has settled around it, and someone applies a specific pressure at a specific point, and the frame releases, and the door moves. She had built this place to prevent a particular kind of thing from happening again. She had built it with the absolute dedication of someone who has paid the full price of unpreparedness and intends never to pay it again. She had built it for herself and for the principle it represented. The principle that a person who does the necessary work should not be at the mercy of other people's willingness or unwillingness to help them. She had built it and stocked it and maintained it, and it was here, and it was sufficient. And she had been right, and they had been wrong. And she had every legitimate claim that a wronged and prepared person has to stand on the correct side of a closed door and let the world outside remain outside. But the voice outside was small. And 30 years ago in the snow against the pine tree, there had been a small voice on the wrong side of a closed door that had not been let in. And the person who had occupied that small voice had survived against all reasonable expectation and had spent 30 years building toward exactly this moment, this door, this choice. She reached out and lifted the latch. The door opened outward against the accumulated snow, and the cold entered the passage in a rush that the passage's retained warmth pushed back against. And in the diminished light of the stormy afternoon, she saw Gideon Kraft and 4 men behind him, coated in snow and ice, and the specific physical evidence of what they had done to get here. And beside Gideon, half sheltered by his body, a boy of perhaps 8 years, the face above the wrapped scarf pale with cold, and the eyes large and direct in the way of children who have gone past fear into the simpler country of immediate need. Nell looked at the boy. She looked at him for a moment that was long enough to be a decision and short enough to look like something else. And then she stepped back from the doorway, and the cold light from outside lit the passage behind her. And she turned and walked into the warmth of the mine, and Cobb moved ahead of her through the passage in the way he moved when he was leading someone through a space they did not know. And the sound of the men's boots on the stone floor followed her into the first chamber, where the lantern light fell on the dark rows of the growing beds. And the smell of living green things met the cold air coming in from the open passage like the meeting of 2 entirely different worlds, which was exactly what it was. She heard the sound that Gideon made when he entered the chamber, and the smell and the warmth and the light reached him. It was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when something he has held as certain is replaced with something he had no category for, when the replacement is complete and immediate, and allows for no transitional negotiation between the old understanding and the new one. She did not turn around. She was already at the stove where the pot had been at a low simmer for the past hour, and she reached for the ladle and she began to serve, because that was what came next, because the work in front of her was the thing that had always governed, and the work in front of her was this. She fed them without ceremony. This was not indifference to their condition. It was the recognition born from 30 years of understanding what bodies require when they have been pushed to the margins of their capacity. That what the 5 men and the boy needed before any other form of interaction was heat and calories delivered without the additional burden of conversation or explanation, or the management of anyone's emotional state. She ladled the mutton stew into the bowls she kept on the shelf above the stove. 6 bowls enough, and she set them on the flat stone surface she used as a table, and she stepped back and she let them eat. They ate in the way of people for whom hunger has moved past the social register into something more fundamental. Gideon Kraft, who in ordinary circumstances ate with the deliberate authority of a man at the head of his own table, ate with his head down and both hands around the bowl, and said nothing. The boy ate with the focused intensity of a child, past the point of manners, the spoon moving from bowl to mouth, with a speed governed entirely by need, and the color began to come back into his face as the warmth of the food moved through him, the pallor of the cold retreating from his cheeks. in the gradual, visible way that warmth reclaims what cold has taken. When the warmth arrives in time, Nell moved through the first chamber while they ate, checking the water channel, checking the lamp levels, doing the things she would have done, regardless of whether anyone was there to observe her doing them. Cobb walked his perimeter, then settled near the boy, close enough that the dog's warmth was available if the boy reached for it, which he did, one hand leaving the bowl to rest briefly on the top of Cobb's broad head before returning to the work of eating. The sound of spoons in bowls and the sound of the water in the channel and the sound of the animals in the far gallery moving with their settled, unhurried rhythms were the only sounds in the chamber for a long time. When the eating was done, Gideon set his bowl down on the stone surface and looked around the chamber with the systematic attention of a man who is trying to understand what he is looking at. He looked at the growing beds, and at the irrigation channel, and at the shelving with its rows of sealed jars, and at the ventilation shaft in the upper wall that allowed a faint current of air to move through the space without allowing the cold to enter at any significant volume. He looked at it all with the expression of someone whose mental model of a situation is being replaced by the evidence of the actual situation. And the replacement is requiring more processing time than he typically needed for revisions of this kind. Because the revision required was not a small one. He said her name, not the way he had said it at the door with the edge of need sharpened by cold and desperation. He said it the way a person says a name when they want to begin a sentence and do not yet have the sentence fully formed, when the name is a way of purchasing time for the words to assemble. She was at the end of the second bed, checking the kale. She did not turn immediately. She finished what she was checking, and then she turned and looked at him. He asked how long. She said 4 years. He looked at the chamber again. 4 years was the entirety of her time in Ironvale, which meant she had begun this work in the same season she arrived, which meant she had come here knowing what she intended to build, which meant the entire 4 years of daily observation from the town's windows, and the entire 4 years of commentary at the smithy and the store steps and the meeting hall had been commentary on something that was real and functional, and that had been in the most practical possible sense right all along. This sequence of understanding moved through Gideon's face with a visibility that he did not try to manage, because the energy required to manage the expression of understanding would have been energy redirected from the understanding itself, and the understanding required everything he had. One of the younger men in the group asked how she had known. About the winter. How she had known it would be this bad. Nell looked at him. She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at the far end of the chamber. And then she looked back at the young man, and what she did next was something she had not done in 4 years in Ironvale, and had done very rarely in the decades before that. Because the telling required a lowering of the specific internal structure she had built to manage the weight of it. And the lowering was not reversible in the way that other things were reversible. And she had not previously been in circumstances where the telling seemed to serve a purpose sufficient to justify the cost. She said the winter of 1863. She said it the way you say the name of a place you live. Once with the particular economy of someone who has said the name only to themselves for many years and knows all of its dimensions without requiring them to be listed. She said there had been a storm that year in the Colorado Territory in the weeks before Christmas that bore the same characteristics as what was happening now. The same sky, the same behavior in the animals, the same quality in the wind before the first snow, the way it moved with a specific steadiness that was not the restless gusting of a passing system, but the calm purposefulness of something that had come to occupy the territory rather than pass through it. She had been traveling that year. She and her husband and their son, who was 8 years old, moving west on a route that the winter had decided to terminate. The chamber was entirely quiet. Even the animals in the far gallery seemed to have settled into stillness. The lanterns held their light without movement. Cobb sat at Nell's feet. She said they had come to a town not unlike Ironvale, a mountain community in a valley with a main street and a general store and a smithy, and families settled into their winter routines. She said they had come to the door of that town in the first hours of the storm and asked for shelter. She said there had been a meeting, brief and not unkind in its language, in which the town's leadership had explained that the stores they held were calculated for their own households through to spring, and that there was not a margin that allowed for additional people. She said the explanation had been delivered with the specific regret of people who have made a decision they know is defensible and wish it felt better than it does. She said her husband had died on the 4th day, her son on the 6th. She had not been with them when each one went because she had been moving, because movement was the only alternative to the cold that had her, because movement produced a small amount of metabolic heat. That stillness did not. And she had moved until she could not move. And then she had stopped. And she had been found 9 days after the storm began by a trapper who had come through the pass on a route he took every year and had almost missed her, because what was visible above the snow was very small. She stopped talking. The young man who had asked the question was looking at her with the expression of someone who asked a question, expecting one kind of answer, and received a different kind. Entirely an answer that reclassified the question itself into something more consequential than it had appeared to be when he asked it. She said she had spent 30 years learning everything that could be learned about the kind of winter that had killed her family. She said she had learned to read the specific signs in the sky and the animals and the wind that indicated when a winter of that category was forming, because those signs existed, and they were readable by anyone willing to spend the time required to learn them and to take the evidence seriously when the evidence appeared. She said she had come to Ironvale because the geography of the valley and the abandoned mine had offered her the conditions she needed to build what she needed to build. She said she had not expected to use what she built to supply a town. She had built it because she had promised herself in the snow outside a closed door in 1863 that she would never again be the person at the door. She stopped. She looked at Gideon Kraft. He was looking at her, and there was nothing in his expression that she recognized from the 4 years of his expressions directed her way. Nothing of the assessment, or the dismissal, or the comfortable authority of a man in a familiar situation. There was something simpler in his face and less managed, the expression of a man who has been disassembled by the events of recent weeks and is sitting in the pieces of himself, and has not yet begun the reconstruction, and is not certain what the reconstruction will look like when it starts. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said that he owed her more than he knew how to say. She said the town needed a supply system. She said they could talk about what he owed her when the weather broke. This was not coldness. It was precision. The situation had specific requirements, and the situation's requirements were the thing that needed to govern the next several weeks. And the space that might exist for other kinds of reckoning was not the space of a chamber in a mine, in the middle of a catastrophic winter with a town's survival. As the proximate concern, she had learned this organization of priorities in the hard school of experience, and she applied it now with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she applied to the irrigation channel and the soil amendment and every other component of the system she had built and maintained. She laid out the plan. Gideon and 2 of the stronger men would make the trip up the mountain every 2 days. The path between the town and the mine would be established on this first return journey and would be maintained by each successive trip. The passage through the deep snow packed and marked in a way that made the route navigable by people who knew where it went. She would prepare supply loads of a specific composition, balanced for caloric density against weight, designed to be carried by 2 men over the terrain in question at the temperatures they would be encountering. She told Gideon the quantities she could release on each cycle, without compromising the mine's ability to sustain production through the remainder of the winter, because the production was the thing that made all subsequent cycles possible, and it required maintenance, and the maintenance required resources, and those resources had to be accounted for. She said Doc Pruitt was to be told the full situation and given the authority to distribute the supplies according to medical priority. She said children under 12 and adults over 65 received first allocation. She said this without sentiment, in the tone of someone stating a protocol rather than expressing a preference. But the protocol had been chosen for the reason that protocols are chosen when they are good ones, which is that it reflected the clearest available understanding of where the resources would do the most essential work. Gideon listened with the attention of a man who had been in the position of deciding things and explaining things his whole adult life, and was now in the position of receiving instruction, and who was finding the experience of receiving instruction from this specific person in this specific place to be something other than the diminishment he might have anticipated. He asked precise questions about load weights and trip timing and the condition of the path on the upper section, and she answered each one with the specificity of someone who has thought about the relevant variables at length, and the conversation had the quality of 2 capable people working on a problem that was larger than either of them and required both of them to be fully present. When the details were settled, she showed him the path markings she would use on the return journey, the specific cairn placement on the upper section that would serve as navigation in conditions of low visibility, the hand signals for wind conditions that would tell the approaching party from the mine entrance whether the approach was safe to continue or whether shelter should be sought until conditions changed. She had a system for this. She had designed a system for exactly this contingency over the 4 years she had been building, because the possibility that the mine might need to function as a supply point rather than solely as a refuge was one she had considered and prepared for, because she had learned to prepare for the contingencies her planning could identify, rather than relying on the contingencies not arising. The group left in the late afternoon when the weather permitted a window of reduced wind that she had learned to recognize as the characteristic midday reprieve of high-pressure systems that were settling rather than passing. She sent them with the first load carefully distributed across the 5 adults, and she stood at the entrance of the mine and watched them descend into the white valley until the snow in the distance reduced them to small moving shapes and then to nothing. Cobb sat beside her at the entrance. The valley below held the particular stillness of deep winter in mountain country, the stillness that is not silence, but the absence of the ordinary sounds of human activity, the animals and the vehicles, and the voices that fill a working community's air in other seasons. The smoke from the chimneys was visible as thin vertical lines above the rooftops, straight up in the calm air of the reprieve window, and the sight of those lines that evidence of fires maintained and households persisting was something she looked at for a long time before she went back inside. The next 6 weeks had the quality of a sustained and demanding piece of work. Every 2 days the group arrived. Every 2 days she had the load ready. Every 2 days Gideon asked questions, and she answered them, and the questions changed in character as the weeks progressed, moving from the operational concerns of the supply runs toward the more substantive questions of technique and method. that she recognized as the beginning of genuine learning rather than the extraction of immediate utility. He asked about the soil amendment process, and she explained it. He asked about the ventilation system, and she walked him through the engineering of it. The relationship between the inlet shaft and the outlet point, and the pressure differential that created the circulation. He asked about the water source, and she showed him the seam in the rock and the channel she had fitted to carry the water to the beds. She did not teach with the performed patience of someone doing a good deed. She taught with the directness of someone conveying information that the recipient needed, and that would be wasted on a recipient who was not fully present. And Gideon was fully present in a way that she noted with the neutral acknowledgement she brought to observations that were useful rather than satisfying. Whatever the man had been before the winter stripped him. What remained was a capacity for attention that had apparently been present all along, but had not previously been directed toward anything that required it this completely. He brought one of the other men on the third trip and introduced him as someone who needed to understand the soil work. He brought a different person on the fifth trip for the ventilation system. He was, she understood, distributing the knowledge she was providing across the people who would be responsible for the subsequent applications of it, which indicated a kind of forward planning that she had not previously associated with him, and that she adjusted her assessment to accommodate. Doc Pruitt sent a message with the group on the second trip, a brief written note in the precise hand of a man who wrote carefully and concisely, expressing his thanks and reporting on the distribution system he had established, and asking two specific questions about nutritional priorities for the households with young children. She wrote answers to both questions on the back of his note and sent it back with the group, and this exchange established a correspondence that continued through the weeks of the supply operation. A practical dialogue between two people who were managing different aspects of the same emergency with the particular efficiency of professionals who respect each other's competence without requiring social elaboration. She did not go down to the town during these weeks. There was no practical reason to make the descent, and the practical reasons were the governing criteria. Everything required at the mine was in the mine. Everything she could contribute to the town's situation was being contributed through the supply runs. The exchange was complete and functional without her physical presence in the valley, and her physical presence was required at the mine because the mine's operation was not self-maintaining in her absence, and the mine's operation was the thing that made everything else possible. She was also, though she would not have used the word, not ready. 30 years of a particular kind of solitude develops structures that are not easily or quickly modified. The way timber framing develops a specific relationship to load over time that is not changed without deliberate and careful work. She had built her interior life around the understanding that the people she encountered were not people she was part of, that her relationship to any community was one of proximity rather than belonging, that the function she served was practical rather than social, and that this was sufficient and right. The weeks of the supply operation were not changing this understanding. They were, however, introducing evidence that complicated it in the way that a structure begins to show the need for modification, not through dramatic failure, but through the accumulation of small signs that the current configuration is no longer exactly adequate to the load it is carrying. The signs were small. The way Gideon said her name when he arrived, which had changed from the first desperate saying at the door, through the formal acknowledgement of the early supply runs, to something that was simply and plainly. Her name said the way you say the name of someone whose presence in a situation is a given, rather than a surprise. The way the men on the supply runs began to ask questions that were not operational. The small personal inquiries that signal the beginning of the kind of interest that is not about information, but about the person who holds it. The way the boy who came on the fourth trip, wrapped in extra layers his mother had clearly added to the ones Nell had observed on his first visit, sat near Cobb and talked to the dog with the comfortable familiarity of a child who has decided that a particular dog is his specific friend, and that this relationship does not require anyone's formal authorization. The boy's name was Thomas. She learned this from Gideon on the fourth trip offered without her asking one of the small pieces of information that people offer when they are moving from the functional relationship of a transaction toward the more complex relationship of people who know each other. She did not ask more about Thomas or his family, but she noted the name the way she noted things that mattered without yet knowing the full dimension of their mattering. In the 7th week of winter, the temperature began to change. It changed in the way of mountain winters, not suddenly and not without reversals. With cold days between the mild ones and the occasional last storm arriving without apology in what appeared to be the season's final negotiation before releasing its hold. But the direction was clear to someone who knew how to read it, and the direction was toward spring, toward the loosening of the valley's frozen isolation, toward the return of the mail route and the trade wagons, and the connection to the larger world that Ironvale had been without since October. The snowpack on the valley floor began to compact and darken at its surface. The water in the main channel that ran along the east edge of town, which had been silent and still under its ice since November, could be heard moving beneath the surface on the mild afternoons, the ice thinning from below. The birds returned before any other sign, the small mountain birds first. The nuthatches and the Clark's nutcrackers moving through the spruce stands with the particular busy energy of creatures resuming interrupted business. On a Monday in late February, the first wagon from the county road broke through. It came up the South Pass with a team of 4 horses and a driver who had made the passage as soon as the road was sufficiently clear to attempt carrying the mail that had accumulated at the relay station for 11 weeks and a quantity of basic supplies that the relay station manager had assembled. When the reports from the mountains indicated the severity of what Ironvale had endured, the wagon came through the gap in the lower ridge and down the main street, and the people of Ironvale came out of their houses to meet it in the way that isolated people meet the arrival of the larger world, with a mixture of relief and the particular disorientation of people who have been in extremity long enough that the return of ordinary things feels slightly unreal. Gideon Kraft was on the street when the wagon arrived. He helped unload the supplies with the men who had made the supply runs with him through the winter, working with a physical ease that was different in quality from the way he had worked before the winter. Less the ease of confidence and more the ease of a man who has found through the stripping away of the surplus what his actual capacity is, and no longer requires the surplus to feel adequate. That afternoon he came up the mountain alone, not for supplies. The supply operation had concluded with the arrival of the wagon, the emergency resolved by the restoration of the connection to the outside. He came up alone with Cobb meeting him on the lower section of the path and accompanying him the rest of the way, which was something the dog had begun doing on the later supply runs, extending his range on the path in a way that Nell had not instructed and had not discouraged. She was in the second chamber when he arrived, taking inventory of the winter's consumption in preparation for the replenishment that the spring would require. She heard him come through the passage, and she continued her inventory for a moment. And then she set the ledger on the shelf and turned. He stood in the chamber entrance with his hat in his hands and the light of the lanterns on his face, and his face had the quality that she had noticed in it across the latter weeks of the supply operation, the quality of a man who has had something removed that he did not know he was carrying until it was gone, and who is still adjusting to the lightness. He said the town wanted to offer her something. He said the council had met what remained of the council's function in the battered and reduced bureaucracy of a community that had spent 11 weeks in survival mode and had agreed that what she had done warranted a formal recognition. He said there was a proposal to give her a position, a formal role in the town's governance, the head of whatever body was going to be responsible for the community's emergency preparedness going forward. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no. She said it without elaboration and without apology, with the same direct economy she brought to all her statements of position. He looked at her. He said he had expected she would say no. She said she had something else in mind. She said she had been thinking about it across the weeks of the supply runs, thinking about what the town needed. That was not what the town was likely to think it needed, which was food stores and better-built structures and improved woodpile calculations, all of which were true and necessary, but were not the foundational thing. She said the foundational thing was knowledge. She said the people of Ironvale had been at the mercy of a winter they had not recognized because they had not known what to look for. Old Virgil had applied his 50 years of mountain experience with complete confidence and had been entirely wrong, not because his experience was insufficient, but because the specific category of winter he was trying to predict was a category he had encountered only once in his life, 30 years ago, and had not retained the specifics of, in a form that his current forecasting system could access. The other people of the town had deferred to his experience because they did not have a framework for evaluating it, because reading weather at the level required for this kind of forecasting was a skill that the town's collective knowledge did not include and had never thought to include. She said she would open the mine, not as a property transfer, not as a gift, as a teaching facility. Every autumn, for as long as she was capable of doing it, she would run a series of sessions in which anyone from Ironvale who wished to attend could come to the mine and learn the things that the mine's operation required knowing. How to read the sky and the animals for the specific indicators that distinguished a significant winter from a manageable one. How to calculate food stores against realistic rather than optimistic winter durations. How to build soil in difficult conditions. How to manage water in an environment where water is the limiting variable. How to construct systems that continue to function under the pressures that the systems were built to address. She said she was not doing this to be recognized or to be forgiven, or to be made a part of something she had spent 30 years being apart from. She was doing it because the gap between what the town knew and what the town needed to know was a gap that would kill people again in the next significant winter, which would come again because significant winters came again, and because she had the knowledge to narrow that gap and the remaining years to do the narrowing, and it seemed to her the most sensible application of both. Gideon stood with his hat in his hands and listened to this, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said that what she had described was not the kind of thing that people typically offered to communities that had treated them the way Ironvale had treated her. She said that what people typically did and what was sensible to do were frequently different things, and that she had made a practice of preferring the sensible. He said he would bring it to the council. She said to bring it to Doc Pruitt first, because Pruitt would have thought about the practical implementation more carefully than the council, and his input would improve the proposal before the council saw it. Gideon looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the position in his face that a smile would have occupied if the situation had been one that called for smiling, which it was not quite because there was still too much weight in it for that. He put his hat back on. He thanked her in the direct, unelaborated way of a man who has moved past the stage of excessive gratitude into the simpler stage of genuine appreciation, which is quieter but carries more. He went back down the mountain. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early March, when the snow was still thick on the upper slope, but the lower path was clear, and the valley showed the first brown patches of exposed ground. Where the sun had been working longest, Nell came down the mountain. It was the first time she had descended into Ironvale since October. She had not planned the specific day. She had risen in the morning and done the morning work, and eaten and looked at the condition of the path and the condition of the day, and determined that there was no practical reason to remain at the mine, and that there were practical reasons to go to the valley, the most concrete of which was the delivery of the written proposal. She had spent the previous week preparing the formal outline of the teaching program she had described to Gideon. The practical reasons were real. They were also, she was honest with herself about this, not the only reasons. She came down the path with Cobb at her heel and the document in her pack, and the morning sun on the eastern face of the ridge, making long, warm shadows across the snow. The town appeared below her. As she descended, growing from the abstract collection of roof lines, she could see from the mine entrance into the specific and familiar structures of the main street, and she walked toward it with the straightforward step of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. She came into the main street from the east end. The people who were out in the street in the mid-morning of a working day paused as she passed. Not conspicuously, not with the pointed attention of people watching a spectacle, but paused in the way that people pause when someone who has been in their lives in a particular way is present in a new way. And the new way requires a moment of reorientation before the ordinary motion of the day can resume. Gideon Kraft was outside the smithy when she passed. He was working on something at the anvil in the open front, and he looked up when Cobb appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision and registered Nell behind him. He set the hammer down on the anvil with a care that suggested he was not putting it down because he was done with it, but because something else had become the prior matter. He looked at her. She stopped. They looked at each other in the morning light of the main street with the sounds of the waking town around them, and the smell of the forge, and the cold, clean air of the March mountain morning, and all of the winter that lay between the people they had been in October and the people they were now. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." It was not an inadequate exchange, for the specific weight of what it contained, the accumulated weather of 4 years and 11 weeks, and a night at a closed door, and 6 weeks of mountain supply runs, and a conversation in a lantern-lit chamber. It was perhaps exactly sufficient. There is a kind of communication that runs below the level of language that moves in the specific frequencies of shared experience and shared survival, and the rearrangement of one person's understanding of another. And what moved between them on the main street of Ironvale on that March morning was of that kind. She continued to Doc Pruitt's office. Pruitt was in, and he received the document with the focused attention of a man who had been thinking along parallel lines and was glad to have the parallel made explicit. They sat in his small office and went through the proposal together, Pruitt asking precise questions, and Nell answering them, and Pruitt suggesting adjustments that she considered and in most cases agreed with, because they were good adjustments. The adjustments of someone who understood the town's practical situation and the proposal's practical requirements with equal accuracy. When they were done, he said that he thought the proposal would be accepted. He said it in the way he said things that he had decided were true, after examining the evidence without qualifying hedges that reflected uncertainty rather than precision. She said she did not need it to be accepted. She said she was offering it because it was the sensible thing to offer, and that the town's acceptance would make the delivery easier. but that the offer existed independent of the response. He said he understood that, but that he thought it would be accepted anyway. He said that people who have nearly died tend to be more receptive to practical wisdom than people who have not, and that Iron Veil had recently achieved a very high degree of receptivity. She allowed herself a small expression of something that lived in the vicinity of humor, without being exactly humor, the particular facial response of a person who finds an observation accurate in a way that produces a version of amusement that does not require the full apparatus of amusement to register. She left Pruitt's office and walked back through the main street toward the eastern path that led up the mountain. Thomas was outside the house 3 doors from the smithy with a stick and a patch of remaining snow that he was applying the stick to, with the purposeful creativity of a child who has found a project. He looked up when Cobb approached, and Cobb went to him the way Cobb went to him now, directly and without ceremony. And the boy put both arms around the dog's neck with the ease of established affection. Nell stopped. She looked at the boy and the dog in the thin March sunlight, and she was aware of being in a specific moment, in a specific place. Aware of it the way you are aware of a thing when you are present in it, rather than moving through it towards something else, which was not a state she occupied frequently. She had organized her life around the forward movement through tasks and seasons, and the accumulation of the practical and the functional and stillness in the present moment was not something she had cultivated. But she stood in the main street of Iron Veil on a March morning with her dog's head in a child's arms, and the smell of the forge in the air, and the sound of the town going about the resumed ordinary business of a community that had come through something that would live in its collective memory for a generation. And she stood there, in it rather than moving through it. Thomas looked up at her over Cobb's neck and said that Cobb was the best dog. She said that he was. Thomas said that he was going to have a dog exactly like Cobb when he grew up. She said that was a reasonable ambition. He released the dog and returned to his stick and his snow project with the complete ease of transition that children possess, moving from one thing to the next without the weight of what the previous thing signified. And Cobb came back to her side. She turned and walked toward the east path. The mountain was above her as it had always been, its upper ridgeline, still white against the March sky, the sandstone face of the Copper Ridge Formation visible from the valley floor, as it always had been the mine entrance invisible from this distance, its location known only by people who had reason to know it. She had spent 4 years walking up toward that invisible point every morning, and the walk had had a specific quality in all those years. The quality of a person moving toward the place where they were necessary, and away from the place where they were not. And that quality had been so consistent across 4 years that she had come to accept it as a permanent description of the geometry of her life. She was not certain that description was as accurate as it had been. She was not certain what the more accurate description was. She was 63 years old, and she had spent 30 years building toward a specific thing: the self-sufficiency and the knowledge and the capacity to never again be the person at the wrong side of a closed door. And she had built it, and she had it. And it had been exactly what she had promised herself it would be. The winter had proved the proof. The system had held, and the knowledge had been real, and the preparation had been sufficient, and more than sufficient. And in the proving of the proof, something had shifted in the geometry. She had opened a door. She had opened it for a specific reason: that she understood fully the voice of a child and the memory of a child, and the principle that the innocent should not be made to pay for the failures of the guilty. She had opened it, and the opening had not undone what she had built, and had not made her dependent in the way she had organized her life to prevent. and had not in any of the ways she had anticipated. It might diminish the thing she had built over 4 years and 30 years. It had done something else. Something she did not yet have the full language for. Something that had been occurring incrementally across 11 weeks of supply runs and conversations in the lantern-lit chamber, and the correspondence with Pruitt, and the morning on the main street, and the exchange with Gideon and the boy and the dog. She reached the lower section of the path and began to climb. Cobb moved ahead of her on the trail in the way he moved when they were going up together, ranging slightly forward and then checking back the easy rhythm of a creature entirely at home in the task and the landscape. The path rose through the lower spruce stands, and the air changed as the altitude increased, thinning and cooling, and taking on the clean mineral quality of high country air. The specific freshness that Nell had learned to associate with this altitude and this mountain, and that she recognized as the smell of the place she had made her life. At the point on the path where the tree line broke and the open shoulder began, she stopped, as she sometimes did, and looked back at the valley. Iron Vale below was small in the way of mountain towns seen from height, a collection of structures along a single street, smoke from the chimneys of the resumed domestic fires, the wagon in the main street that had arrived that morning with lumber from the county seat, the figures of people moving between the buildings with the purposeful movement of a community returning to its ordinary functions after the interruption of the extraordinary. She could see the smithy at the north end and the smoke from its forge, and she could see the general store with its shutters open for the first time since November, and she could see the small figures of people on the street, whose faces she could not distinguish at this distance, but whose presence she knew. She stood and looked at it. She had stood at various points above various towns over 30 years, and looked down at them from the outside, from the particular elevation of a person who has arranged their life to be above and apart from the thing they are looking at. And the view had always been the same view. The view of the not belonging of the place that was there and that she was not of. This view was different. She could not have said precisely how or when it had changed. She could have listed the events, the door and the supply runs and the conversations in the morning on the street. But the listing would not have captured the thing itself, which was not a series of events but a shift in the quality of what she was looking at. When she looked down, a shift that was small enough that she had not noticed it happening, and was only now standing on the open shoulder with the valley below and the mine above, and the mountain air around her registering the fact of it. She was not standing outside the town. She was standing above it, which was a different position. Above implied a relationship, a connection between the higher point and the lower one, a line of sight that ran between them rather than across them. She had been outside these 30 years. Outside had no line of sight. Outside was the position of someone who has calculated that the cost of the line of sight exceeds the value of what the line might reveal. She stood on the open shoulder and looked at Iron Vale, and she felt the line of sight. Cobb had come back to her while she was standing the way he came back, when she was still for longer than the path required, and he sat beside her and looked up at her face with the amber attention she had received for 9 years and never found insufficient. She put her hand on his head. She stood there for a while longer, the mine above her and the town below, and the mountain around both of them, the same mountain it had always been, patient and enormous and indifferent, in the way of things that exist on a scale that dwarfs the concerns of the lives conducted on their surfaces. And for once the indifference was not the most present quality. The most present quality was something smaller and more particular. the specific warmth of a hand on a dog's head, and the specific sight of a town below in the March sunlight, and the specific feeling of being in a place where what you knew and what you had built and who you were had been asked for and had been given and had been in the most essential and irreducible sense enough. She turned and continued up the mountain, Cobb moving ahead with the easy confidence of an animal going home, and the path took them through the remaining snow and the sandstone and the cold, still air of the upper ridge, and into the entrance and down through the passage, and into the warmth and the green and the water sound of the place she had made, and she set her pack down and lit the lamp and went to work. And the work was exactly what it had always been. And it was also something more than it had been, the way a thing that has been used for its full intended purpose acquires a quality it did not have before, the using a quality of completion that the mere existence of the thing, however well built, cannot produce on its own.